Hello, and thank you for joining me in my visit to Spain. We should be looking at the areas around Granada and right down to the coast of Motril and the area of the Costa Tropical. Indeed, from some of the shots you'll see, it was very tropical when I was there. My visit was during spring, and so we see the early butterflies and some wonderful flowers and bushes coming out into blossom and bloom around the mountain areas. I went for three reasons. The first, of course, was to paint, and to travel and paint from the coast right up into the mountains around Granada, into the Sierra Nevada, where I not only enjoyed the painting side, but of course went skiing and fishing in the lakes and the rivers that cascaded down from the mountains when the snow was melting. But then, of course, there was also the wonderful scenery and the architecture. Going to the Alhambra, for instance, I'll show you some shots of that. So this video isn't just going to be about painting, it's going to be about the actual trip, the beautiful place, exploring it with me and seeing the types of work we can do from the different types of scenery. And the third area I'm going to show you is, of course, the natural history, the wildlife and the insects, the birds and the flowers of the countryside and surrounding area, which all help to make a wonderful stay, a wonderful visit. You might notice that when doing the camera work I use a lot of stills, and I try and use my camera very much as an artist will look for compositions. I'm quite happy for you to take any of these compositions and use them for your own paintings. As far as I'm concerned, there's no copyright to these pictures. If you wish to use the scenes that I've taken on here to explore and paint and enjoy yourself, having seen how to do some of these techniques on this video, I should be only too pleased for you to do that. I'm going to use water-based mediums only on this video, so watercolour straight, watercolour with pastel over the top, pastel with water, pastel over acrylic ink, and some actual acrylic paints. I feel it important that we choose the medium carefully for the type of work we're doing and for the type of scene. I'm also going to use some Chinograph pencil with my work and work watercolour over the pencil quite loosely and boldly. This video is going to be divided up into sections, and we'll look at painting different types of scenery. We shall look at landscape, we shall look at townscapes and villages, street scenes. We should look at painting the orange groves both from a distance and close up. Even doing these few shots here, you see the different types of work we could do, from zooming in on flowers and doing quite delicate work with watercolour or watercolour pencil, to maybe the use of a much more lively approach here with watercolour and pastel over the top. And then with these lovely olive groves and olive trees and the twisted gnarled trunks, we might go into the Chinograph pencil or stick and ink or pen and ink and watercolour. There are so many ways we could use mediums to enhance the picture that we're seeing and the feeling we have about these places. And as I repeat, you're most welcome to use any of these shots for your own pictures if you wish. Whether you're using either the video version or the DVD version of this film, you should be able to put your machine onto pause and then work from any of these single shots to make studies and use the technique that I'm showing you. These two particular shots would work rather well either using acrylic paint over the watercolour and tinting in, or by using masking fluid and then working up the flowers afterwards, having done a wet into wet background. Here you see the amount of oranges that are swept down the rivers and pile up around the lakes there. It's quite an unusual and incredible sight, and of course you've got these very bright colours against the more earthy colours of the Spanish background. Carp thoroughly enjoying themselves, sucking at the orange peel and bringing off little insects there. and the atmosphere that's created between the mountains at different times of day and evening, these lovely whitewashed houses with the red terracotta roofs. And then of course down on the Costa Tropical, these crystal clear waters and almost semi-tropical palm trees growing there, enhanced by the use of the Spanish making these wonderful little cafes and areas with palm fronded umbrellas and shading. As in Portugal, we have these lovely little bright coloured fishing boats that make great compositions. And later on in the film we will pop down to Portugal and take a look at the difference between the Spanish craft here and the beaches and the Portuguese craft, and even the townscape and decoration of their buildings. Another reason for my visiting Spain and Portugal was to find a property that I can move to permanently from the UK. I wanted a place that is reasonably priced, is much warmer than this country, and has the space and accommodation to have a gallery, studios and workshop, and of course somewhere that would be pleasant to have visitors and guests and students coming to stay with me and do their work. Unfortunately, with the many programs that have been on about travelling and buying properties abroad, it's getting much harder now to find a bargain. You can still find properties reasonably priced further inland, but along the coast now it's been far more developed and it's far harder to find a cheaper property. And so after thoroughly enjoying searching Portugal and Spain, I have in fact finished up buying a place in the south of France. Many of the villages have their own public springs where you can take water and collect water, and the villagers themselves collect this and use it rather than actually using the tap water. As the mountain streams come down, they collect mineral deposits, and you see here the tiles actually tell you which parts of your body these are supposed to keep healthy and enhance. The whole countryside is full of historical towns and villages and streets, old Roman bridges and roads, and the past history of the whole Spanish culture. At this time of year, being spring, it's a wonderful time for seeing the early flowers and the fresh new leaves. The oranges and lemons are still remaining from the winter, and all of the trees are now beginning to blossom with fresh new buds. I was amazed by the very clever use the Spanish make of their water resources, with these channels cut and diverted down and round through all the groves and the campus, being able to channel off into their little areas of garden and around the trees the small amount of water they do have, especially through the summertime. It really does show how people can work together and how a community can work together in using their natural resources. Right, let's get down to some painting from now on. We've seen the countryside, we'll see a little more of it in between the shots of actually showing you how to paint, but from now on we're getting down to the business end. Here are my brushes. When I'm travelling I have to keep both the tools and materials to a minimum, obviously, both for the flights and cases and for where I'm staying. Just one oval mop and 3 sizes of each of flats, round and the swords. I keep a fairly broad palette, and what we'll do now is show you some sheets of the colours that I take with me, because you never know what you're going to need, especially in flower painting. This is my whole palette, but I will show you these sheets in more detail now so that you can put your video or DVD player onto pause and then make notes of the colours that I'm taking with me. Since this video was made, I've added 2 more colours to this palette of Quincridrome Red and Quincridrome Yellow, both wonderful colours and strong colours for doing red roofs and terracotta work. I travel light, a small carry box for the materials and a little stool and an easel, and I'm ready to paint. Hi, I thought to start off this video of painting in Spain I'd do a small watercolour showing the basics of watercolour, nearly all the things you'll need to do in one watercolour. We'll look at wet into wet, we'll look at masking fluid, we'll look at the warms to cools, we'll look at wet next to wet, and sort of go through the basic techniques of watercolour on one painting before showing you more advanced ways in other painting. In fact, before we even do that, let's take a look at some of the paintings I will already do on this holiday and show you the different ways of working in those. Here a small watercolour looking under a canopy of trees up a little leafy lane. A street scene where this figure helps to add scale to the village. The use of watercolour much more opaquely and heavily. A more transparent watercolour. And then pastel over watercolour for the bright poppies on the banks. Pastel directly onto watercolour paper with an acrylic ink background. Chinograph pencil, watercolour and pastel. Just straight watercolour. A pastel over acrylic ink again, a deep blue ground. Let's do this painting now of a little village called Pinos up on the hillside here. Lovely white buildings with little red roofs. I've already done the masking fluid on the painting, I've already drawn it out so that I can get straight on with the demonstration. Now masking fluid is a liquid latex that we can paint onto the paper. Here you can see the liquid latex. And these areas are going to be white paper when this rubs off later. We put the latex on and we leave it till the painting is completely dry, then remove the latex and we can tint back some of the white areas or we can leave them pure white. So these are my highlights in this palm tree leaves and some of the little white daisies around here, and over here we have the buildings of Pinos, which will just tint in with some shadows at the end. So we're ready to go. We have the paints, the watercolours you see there already laid out, ready to be damped down. The brushes I've gone through with you, and you see my water, everything ready. And you've also seen in this shot of me looking from the distance, you notice that I've got a thing called an easel across my knees. It's a little easel that we can unfold that just goes across my legs and holds the board tidily without having to put a great big three-legged easel up. So I'm really comfortable on my little camping stool and ready to go with this painting. We'll start with the sky. Nearly always in watercolour we tend to start with the sky and work our way down. Then while the sky is drying I'm going to come down to the water. In fact I'm actually sitting here a little bit too low and I'm going to have to stand up for a moment just to paint the water in, these areas here of the lake. Then I can sit down again and continue with the rest. So the sky first. What I'm doing now is just wetting the watercolours. You notice I'm using tube watercolours and put them into little palettes where they will dry when I'm not using them. And as soon as I damp them again, then they're going to be wet enough to paint with. So you can use the little blocks of watercolour in pans. These are just the same as these, or you can use it this way. With the liquid watercolours I find they tend to go a little bit softer more quickly, and I prefer it that way, and of course I can have more paint out with the size pans that I want. So these are the liquid tube watercolours put into my own palettes, and then they dry out when they're not in use. I just damp them before I'm about to start when I'm ready to paint with them. I've taped the paper down with some ordinary masking tape. I haven't bothered stretching this paper. Stretching means that we'd wet the paper so that it expands and then tape it down with brown tape, let it dry so it stretches out again, so when we paint there'll be no cockling. But I'm going to use £140 Bockingford here, which is quite a nice paper, and with a small sheet like this shouldn't cockle too much, so ordinary masking tape is fine. I'm going to wet the sky all over first with clean water. I've got a big oval mop here, my nice big oval mop look. I'm going to give the paper a thin rinse of yellow ochre to start with. Just down into these trees a little. I just want to give a little bit of warmth to my sky. Just down to the hills here. Very thin wash of yellow ochre. You can see how thin that is. Flick off any loose, any liquid that's not required. A little bit stronger in the paint, I think, on that. Just a little bit stronger on the yellow ochre across this hillside. You see the drawing I've done is very loose. I don't need to have lots of detail because I can draw actually with the paint as I'm going on. All I need to know is my main places and where they are. Now I can start putting in some blues, and there's a lot of warm in the blue in this med sky today. So we've got quite a lot of, I'm not going to use cerulean up here, this is a cool blue. I'm going to start off with some cobalt blue and just drop it in here because there's a very fluffy sort of sky today, and I don't mind that sky. So a bit of cobalt blue, which is a mid-blue, and just tickle it in, look, leaving those bits of yellow ochre in between. Look what a lovely sky we get. You see, I've got my board at a slight angle, so the blue is dropping downwards slightly, which gives me a slight furry effect in my paint. Let's come round with that blue and be a little bit stronger with the pigment now, so a little bit more paint on my brush. I'm going to bring it round in a series of circular shapes of stripes to give this feeling of these very high cirrus clouds coming in here. Just a few flicks, keep it simple, keep it clean, and some of that blue is coming down in between these palm fronds here, leaving the rest white. Now if I wanted to do a bit more, I can come back and maybe be just a little stronger with some blue. I'm going to put a tiny touch of ultramarine up in the sky up here. Ultramarine's a bit warmer blue. It will just give me that bit more richness up here in these blues against that nice mid-blue. So just dabbing it in, just a little touch of my brush, letting the watercolour do the work. We let the watercolour, the accident, the beauty of the watercolour, do the work for us. You see, just dabbing this in now, I'll just put a little bit more in the middle, just to show you what I mean, a little bit stronger blue here. You see how that just spreads out on its own and gives these lovely effects. And there we are, instant sky, as quick as that. So watercolour can be a very, very quick and easy medium. We let the watercolour do the work for us. Okay, now I'm going to come down to the water. So I've got to stand up a little bit to do this. Right, I'm standing up now, as you see, and you can see that the easel is quite handy now because I can actually hold the easel with one hand while I stand and do a little bit of work on the water here. I want to get the feeling of some sunlight around the water glinting down here, even though it isn't quite that. On the actual picture the light has changed. What I'm going to do is come in with a I'm going to put a little bit of clean water here across the centre where I want the light to gleam, just through this area, and I'm going to come in with a little aureolin yellow, which is a very light yellow, through here to give this feeling of light, and then with my brush just scumble across a little bit too strong. That I'm going to soften it. I've cleaned my brush and I'm just going to soften that back a bit. Now I'm going to use a little bit of Viridian, come in with that each side of that yellow. This is just to give me a sort of sunlit glow across the water. And then I shall use now some cerulean blue, a very light blue. And I'm going to use the roughness of the paper to leave some white areas showing, glinting. Now coming into that, we'll come back to our ultramarine blue from the sides here. You see how it goes nicely from the warmer, darker blue into the lighter. Just scumble that across, so I leave little bits of light showing. A bit more darker blue along here. On that side as well. Get a nice bit of deep blue reflection coming down. And while it's wet, you'll see the paint drops down into itself. Now I'm going to go a fraction warmer still. I'm going to add a little bit of rose, only a small amount of rose to my blue. And just on this upper edge, oh, it's too much flooding. Just on this upper edge, just come down, get a slightly warmer, softer area there of the hills reflecting in. I'll just do a little bit more of that. That paint was a bit wet. So just this top edge. Come down to this top edge, this deeper colour, and just let it gently spread down, giving an idea of the bank and the hills reflecting into the darker edge of the water there. Here now we've put one colour over another, and I'm blending it in and dragging it across the other colour, and dragging it across the other colour is called the glaze. One colour of another is a glaze. Now I'm going to take the clean brush, the wet clean brush, dry it out a bit with my fingers and just run through this and suck off some paint. You see how the dry brush is sucking up the paint in the middle here, and giving me a light area into the water there. So I've put paint on, and now I'm actually taking paint off. Right, we're going to work on the hills now. Our sky is finished, our water is done as much as I need at the moment, and in watercolour we work from lights to darks. So although we've masked off the whites, I'm not going to put any white paint on. Everything that's light has to be painted a thinner colour over the white. So when we had this very light yellow cloud, we let that glow through with the thin paint, and we put the darker blue on in between, and we left the light showing through. Here we left the lighter areas, the darker colours on top. Now I want to get this feeling of distant mountains coming down gradually warmer towards us. So we're going to have cool, warmer and warmer in the foreground. Foreground, middle distance and distance. I'm going to put a wash right over this of the yellow ochre again, but a little bit stronger this time. A little bit stronger. I'm not going to wet the paper, I'm going straight into it. Now if I wanted to remove some paint at this stage, I could always take some tissue, some ordinary toilet tissue or soft tissue, and lift off the paint. Right down through here, right down through my trees, all the way down to the water. And we've got to work on this fairly quickly because I want to work into the paint while it's still wet. Now that seems fairly warm, and it seems warmer than the background clouds that I did earlier. It is a little bit stronger. I should go a bit stronger still in places, but that's the idea. It's a graduation of change of colour. We don't go straight from one to the other. It gradually changes from lighter to darker, or warm to cooler, and so on. So you see where we just looked at this warm area here. I'm going to put a little bit of Indian red now into my yellow ochre and drop in down here some of the slightly warmer areas while it's still wet to give me a nice soft, slightly out of focus distance. We tend to be in focus in the foreground where our eyes tend to look, and as things go into the distance, both the atmosphere and our eyesight tends to make things look more blurred. The atmosphere means little water droplets in the air, and in the Med usually the air is much clearer, so you have a further distance you can see and the colours are cleaner into the distance. But today it's fairly damp, and back up here it's actually quite a damp sort of day, and I'm going to make this distant hill now using some yellow ochre and a little bit of ultramarine blue because it's fairly distant up there, and just tickle my colour up. It's a little bit warm, I can drop some blue into that later. Just coming up around the top edge. You see I've got a hard edge against the sky now because it's fairly dry, the sky is fairly dry. So that's giving me a sort of rather muddy, warm, greeny colour coming down towards these. Now I'm just going to add a little bit of aureolin yellow into that, give it a little bit more of a greeny tint. So that's now putting one colour next to another, wet next to wet and wet into wet, to give me this distant feeling of the hills. And I can go right down to my masking fluid there because I don't need the white houses to be left because the masking fluid will be rubbed off afterwards. Now while that's still wet, a little bit more blue, get a bit more of the feeling of the distance, back into this and start to just feel the edges of this hill a bit more, a bit sharper. Up we come, look, dropping in these little trees in the distance, get the feeling of these little trees and craggy rocks by little dabs of colour, and the drier the paint becomes, the less this colour will spread. So you see we've got the feeling of that distant hill there, and this is sunlight just glowing without it being too strong. Now taking that same colour, the blue, I want to go a little bit further back. I'm going to come up here and do this mountain. I'm going to show you how to do a graduated wash now. Here I go with the stronger colour on the mountain top. I want to get the feeling of mist between these two mountains, so as I come down here, I'm now going to take some clean water on my brush and just blend that colour down into the paper here. You see how that gives the effect of it being very soft and misty. I've taken away the hard edge. I'm getting the feeling of this colour coming down mistily into this one. And I'm going to go back while it's still wet and work into it. A little touch of the yellow again, a wee touch of green, and we'll just drop in some slightly darker trees back up here. Not a lot coming down there. Right, we've got areas of warm and cool greens going right through the olive groves here now, and little bits of earth which are showing and rock which are showing. We'll start with those warms. I'll just take some of the ochre again and come back and just warm up some of these bits of rock areas that are now closer to us. You see the sharp edges now as I'm painting wet onto dry. So now we're starting to get more detail. This is all fuzzy in the distance. We're starting to get more detail as we come into the foreground. A little warmer. It'll get warmer still when I've finished. And we're playing rough next to smooth, cool next to warm, light next to dark, all the way down. Along the edge of the bank here, and lose that white. Now we want to start playing these cool and warm greens. I'm going to start with a little cerulean blue and just work my way down, because these olive trees are quite a silvery blue, and the cerulean over this, surprisingly enough over the warm, shows quite well. So I'll bring these cools down into here, leaving these little bits of warm earth where I want them showing through, right down through to there. I'll go back to my ultramarine now and start dropping that in. It's a much warmer blue, you see. Darken them down a fraction more. So we're coming in front of this hill here now. We've got some quite dark trees coming in here. You see these colours become stronger than the ones behind. They start then to push the ones behind back. This little round tip brush can be angled to paint a thin line or a darker blob of a tree. So we get darker and darker as these little blobs come down. We haven't got much green yet, you'll notice. I've kept playing with the more subtle shades of cools and warms for the minute. But we are about to go on to the greens. Now I'm going to load my brush with some aureolin yellow. Starts a much more yellowy colour than a little touch of the cerulean into it. It should give me quite a nice mid-green look. Look at this very warm green going in against that nice soft yellowy green I had earlier. Pushing those hills back. One or two slightly darker shadows back here, but not too dark, just one or two, to give the feeling of these trees being closer to us. A bit darker up here for these trees coming over the hill there, against that, until we've got the dark next to the light, cool next to the warm. We're going to now paint the foreground in. All these little blobs here are going to become white daisies later, and there's quite a strong variety of greens through here, very strong greens, much stronger greens than back here. Now to make those greens I'm going to use some much stronger yellows. Let's for instance put in some, just to show you how strong the yellows we can go, let's put in some chrome yellow here. Look how strong that chrome yellow is, really beautifully strong. And if I want to turn that into a green, all I've got to do is add some blue to it. So I'll take some, I'm going to actually mix on the paper here. I'll take some cobalt and just drop it in there, and it gives me this really very strong warmer green in the foreground. And we can go warmer than that too. We can put in some yellow ochre across here and make the greens even with the yellow ochre. I'm making my greens at the moment still using my yellows and blues rather than a bought colour at this stage. I shall drop some brought greens in a moment. So look how lovely and strong these are, and it's dark against the background of the lake here, so I'm coming up dark against that. You see how the variety, I'm changing the variety of greens as I go through, simply by changing from the different yellows to the blues and dropping those darks in. Give a furry effect here. If I want to paint in more detail, at the moment I'm just giving an impression of these leaves and bushes. I'm painting as an impressionist, just playing warms against cools. But if I want to paint in more detail, I shall wait until these colours are a little bit drier, and then I can paint hard edges in. Picking that up through here. I'll paint a bit more detail as we go on. As the paint dries, I shall start getting more and more details. I'm gradually getting darker and darker, getting these shadows in, and how much softer that makes the distance. This will make more sense when I move the masking fluid shortly. You see the little bits of white showing through then with these daisies against the lighter colours and the darker colours. I'm going to add a bit more warmth to this, a bit more warmth still, so I'm going to put some Indian red in with this blue and really start to hit some of these warmer areas in the foreground here of shadow, which will make things, to make these foreground bits come closer still to us and push the background back. And come on to the tree trunk here now. Right, the tree trunk, I'm going to start with a thin coat of a little bit of purple mixed in with a bit of burnt sienna to give me this rather muddy warm. And we're going to work the darker shapes of where the palm leaves have gradually been cut away over the years and they've grown up into that in just a moment. We'll bring that warm up and through into here now. We've got our very light areas where these deep grey marks are. These are the masking fluid areas, so I can afford to paint fairly rapidly and loosely across this and bring these warms into here. It's quite dark up in here. Spread out into the wet paper, tickling it with the brush like this, look. Right, that's got the feeling of that trunk quite nicely. Well, we can always go back and darken it a bit more later if we want to. I'm now going to put in all the brighter yellows and greens of the tree and then gradually work darker into them. When I take the masking fluid off, I'll be left with these little spiky pieces of white, but at the moment I can get all the variation of greens and darks in, wet into wet, and then gradually going wet onto dry as the paint dries. To start with quite a light yellow, my aureolin again, and I can drop the different yellows and browns into this. I haven't got to paint all the details because I'm going to do that in a minute with the darks. My lights are already there, remember, with the masking fluid, so I haven't got to worry about leaving the very light areas behind, because I know I can come back in a minute and pick those out when the masking fluid comes off. All I've got to do at the moment is just get this variety of warm and cool shapes of greens, and then pick out with the darker colours the dark against the light sky behind as I go on. A little bit of yellow ochre just to give me the warmer browns coming down the edges of these palm leaves. You can see the lovely rich luscious colours we can get now using the lighter to the darker colours gradually. We work from light to dark in watercolour nearly all the time. Right, now that cadmium orange I was talking about, there's a lovely orange, and it's catching on some of the edges of the leaves here. It really is a luscious, see how it brings the whole painting alive and forward. Really give myself some nice dark edges here. And I'm just starting now to use a little bit more detail with the tip of the brush. I'm just starting to play with a bit more texturing on these palm leaves. Sap green and a little touch of ultramarine blue now. And I've almost got to change back to a smaller brush now, because it's going to require that I start putting some detail in. So sap green and a touch of burnt sienna, and we've got to actually start painting some darks in of these leaves, which are dark against the sky. This is the warmer green that I want to use, and I shall use some cooler ones as well later. So now we're painting wet onto dry. There's a bit more blue coming into it now. There's a bit more blue in my mixture of the green and the brown. As it comes cooler down here, we've got to constantly re-evaluate. That's what I talk about when I say to students, you're painting penny a yard. The way you buy ribbon, penny a yard. Once you've found something works, it's very tempting just to do that and that only, and not change your colours ever. But the colours do change. Let's look at this bit here. Look how nice that blue green is in between the warmer brown green that I was doing just now. I'm now playing these darks across the lights as they come against the sky back there. Touching up the darker edges where they need to, even one colour inside another. You might find that they change like that look as the shadow comes across them. But this edge here is darker, but that edge just down the centre is darker. There might be a little line there like that. It might suddenly go very dark in there. This is what we've got to discover by looking, by observing. It's not just one colour throughout, it's not just a green tree. These colours change constantly. We've got to be aware. I'm not doing every leaf exactly as it should be up there. I said this earlier, this is a painting, not a photograph. Right, you can see I've really worked into these darker areas now, giving the tree more form, so that we've got shadow going into the centre of it with our cool and warm greens. Our next job is to wipe off the masking fluid, which is going to look quite surprising when it happens. Those little bits of white are going to suddenly appear everywhere and make us panic. We've got to tint those back. So we'll let the painting totally dry for a minute, then we'll wipe that off. Right, you can see here we've taken away the masking fluid from the daisy areas in the foreground. Let's now hit Pinos and give these little white houses a sharp edge. Here we go, look. And then back to the palm tree, and where you thought it was all green, suddenly look, all these little bits of masking fluid that I put on earlier come back. Now we don't want everything all pure white. We don't want these little bits of masking left pure white everywhere, but we do want some of the white bits left. So there we are. Now take my small brush and I'll start to tint these back a little. I'm going to use first of all a little bit of the Iranian yellow, where I think they need to stay fairly light. I'm going to leave some of them white because if you look at the palm tree now, look at the palm tree, you'll notice that there are little bits of very light areas shining on the shiny leaves. So all I want to do is leave some of those shining, and some of them will tint down. It doesn't take an awful lot. Paint, just touches here and there to take things down a bit. And I might use a little Viridian green now, because I want a lighter green amongst some of these areas here. Cool shadows. Viridian's quite a cool green. So if I use that green in the middle there, look, it makes it seem cooler in the centre. The chrome yellow again. And come across some of those lighter areas where the sun shines on the whites. We get the feeling of this very light. Dark around that side. As it comes down, the whole thing makes more sense. Just going to use a little bit of cerulean blue to finish off some of these cooler shadows in the tree. There we go. Now let's come across now to the buildings. We've almost finished our painting, and there are some nice warm blue shadows. Now I'm going to start off with a little cobalt blue. I'm going to move on to the ultramarine fairly quickly because the ultramarine is a much warmer blue, and all I want to do is just find some of the shadowed areas of these buildings, leaving the white edges showing in the sunlight. And then the ultramarine. Not too much of it. Just a little touch of my brush. Persuade it to. It's very hot today. It won't come off. There we are. I'll just feel some of these little dark areas of shadow in the windows up there. Building over here. And we need to show the roofs. So I'm going to use at first a little of the chrome just to find some of the warmer edges of these. And then into the chrome I'm going to place a little rose. Little rose into the chrome to give my red roofs feeling the sunlight up there. Look, there's a little red roof over here too I want in. And there's our painting. Now these little daisies, let's find these little daisies. Back to my aureolin. A little touch of chrome. Mix the two. See if we can just put some of these little bits of yellow flowers back into this. And our daisies. You see we can just touch some of these bits of white with the yellow to keep it nice and fresh. Chrome yellow is fairly opaque, so I can paint an opaque, a transparent colour you can see through, an opaque colour you can't. Lemon yellow is also opaque. And I'll mix a little bit of lemon yellow in a minute and just show you the lemon yellow going on as well, so you can get the feeling of how an opaque colour goes over a transparent. Right, I'm going to mix a little bit of lemon, which is a very opaque colour. I'll drop a bit of lemon yellow in for some flowers here. See how that stands out? It'll dry slightly less colourful, but it is there. So we can paint a little bit of opaque painting, but be careful about that because it can dull a painting down so much. I want something a bit more orange in there, so I'm going to take some of my cadmium orange. Look how beautifully that brings out these buttercups coming through amongst the daisies in the foreground. And again I'll use a little bit of that cadmium orange into my reflections in the palm tree. Work the greens a fraction more, back to my sap green. Just bring that into this a bit more, reflecting into here. I want just a little bit fresher greens in my foreground, a little bit stronger greens here and there against these yellows, just to bring it forward. I reckon we're almost there. Just come down to my indigo again. to just play a little bit of cool in here against those warms. A bit darker in places under there, the cool against the warms. Right, there we go, we'll just sign it. You've seen a whole watercolour produced on the spot quickly as the light changes. There we go. Once you got away from the general tourism and madding crowds of the coast, up in the mountain there was some absolutely gorgeous and glorious scenery and wild flowers that you'd be proud to have growing as a garden in your own home. There was still plenty of snow up in the Sierra Nevadas, and I haven't skied for over 20 years, so I wasn't sure whether I'd still be capable. But I had a go for a day and thoroughly enjoyed it. And whilst I was up there, we managed to get the watercolours out and have a little go at doing a painting. When working like this, make sure you've planned well ahead. Obviously make sure you've got warm enough clothing, that you've taken food and drink with you, and don't expect there to be toilets present. In this case there weren't, and you had to make your own way to either hotels or find a more discreet place to leave the call of nature. Well, here we are at the Sierra Nevada mountains in Spain. Not quite what you might expect of Spain, because you may have the idea of a very arid desert-like area, but Spain is quite diverse. And here we've got these beautiful mountains which people are skiing on even now in early spring. Lovely place to be, and in this case quite warm, quite mild. So I'm going to try a straight watercolour of these distant mountains. The two little figures up there I'll put in as well, and see how we go. I hope about 20 minutes this watercolour. I'm changing the composition slightly because I want to fit things into the paper and make them work.
You don't have to stick to things exactly, we've got to make a painting that works away from the scene. Not just a photograph. I've got my cameras, I can take a photograph whenever I want. We've got some nice chunks of rock sticking up here to the side of this path. See if we can get the layers of those rocks in really strongly later. And that's it, ready to paint. I won't bother with too much of the clouds because there isn't very much cloud at the moment. I'm going to start with my oval wash brush and just a thin coat of yellow ochre just to get the sky going before dropping in my blues. I want to get a more swirly cloud effect. I'm going to make more of the clouds than there is in fact on this because it's rather a boring sky there at the moment. And there's some lovely purples and colours coming down into there as well. So we'll start bringing those in. And I've got to be fairly dark with the sky or it's not going to make the snow look any whiter. So I'm going to paint wet next to wet rather than wet into wet for the sky and then drop more colours in later. Nice slightly pink glow to it over there, so a little bit of rose down here. Not the colours you might always expect for doing a sky like this, but we'll have a go with them. Quite nice delicate colours. Then we'll start to hit those blues. I'm going to come up to my cerulean. A little bit stronger in colour. See, we flip my brush off then just to get some slightly stronger colour from the palette. I can drop in stronger colour when I want. I'm just sort of going around the horizon at the moment. And the sky gets quite dark as it comes over there, so I'm going to work a bit more of that cerulean into the purple. Just dabbing it in and letting the paint do the work. And then around here it gets very strong, so I'm going to come back to my cobalt first and then drop in some ultramarine. Get some really lovely strong blue into that. So cobalt blue first, which is the slightly warmer blue than the cerulean was. There's some water when I need it just to soften things in. And that cobalt comes up into these blues here a bit. It's quite a purple sky against the snow. To soften that down, I'll just put some clean water there and let that blend in. There's a nice bit of cloud up there, softly. Now I want to get much stronger. I really want to get some stronger ultramarine going on down in here now. So I'm going to come into there with some lovely deep blue ultramarine and really get some strength into this sky up here. I may go a bit warmer yet too. I want to add a bit more rose to that ultramarine and make it a bit more purple up at the top end. This corner here to really give some depth to that side, so we can feel the lighter cloud shining in the sun around here, and these lovely deep purpley blues around this top edge. So a little bit of rose, and we'll drop in some of these lovely deep purples into the sky up here, and let them just blend in a bit. That gives rather pleasant. You see the effect there now. Just let it run a little downwards at a slight angle to bring the eye into the painting. To be a little bit stronger around these mountain tops here, so I'm going to come in with the ultramarine yet again a bit more, and a wee touch of mauve, and just go a little bit darker around these mountain tops. I want to let that paint drop into there, let it drop down to the edge of the dry paper, so we get more of a silhouette around there. While it's still wet, we can add these little touches. A bit darker around that mountain top there, I feel, as well. Just in little places, just to bring out the tops of the mountains. If you feel it's too much, then you can always reverse it the other way and drop the paint back a bit. and then level it out. And there we are, ready to go. Sky nice and quickly done. Now we'll have a look at the snow itself. It's fairly warm, and we've got the sun shining directly onto it. There are very few shadows, so I'm going to hit it first with my warm yellows and pinks. I'm going to come in with a little bit of Oriolan yellow first, just a tad. That's a very cool yellow. Just in the odd, not too much of it, just a little bit here and there. The reason I'm doing that is because I want to make the warmer yellows stand out more. I'll come down into this bit later. This is the snowy area up here. Just a little bit of this lighter, more lemony Oriolan yellow. I like that Oriolan because it's so transparent. Such a nice yellow to use. So workable, whereas lemon's a little bit too strong and acidic. Bit of snow coming down there. It's very pink. Now we'll come round to the warmer yellow. I'll go back to the raw sienna mix I made earlier, yellow ochre raw sienna, and we'll drop in, not too much, but just some areas of that. I don't hit up there too much yet, because I want that sharper edge there. I don't want it to suddenly leach in. If there was cloud coming across here, then I would let it leach in to give the effects of the clouds blending into the mountain tops, but as they aren't today, I'm not going to be doing that. So now we've got the effect of this warmer yellow against the cooler one. Remember, watercolour dries somewhat lighter than you put it on, so although I put this on quite strongly, it's darkening out, it's lightening out quite quickly. Now at this stage, if I wanted to, I could get some tissue and take out some odd little bits of cloud. So we can use the tissue to dab out a little bit of the cloud if we want to, that's coming up over the mountain top there. There's a little bit of cloud just coming away from the tip of the mountain. Look, we can get some effects of, see how that's being lifted out there to give the effect of the snow and the cloud just blowing around at the top of that. I'll do a little bit over here, just not too much, just dabbing a bit out. So it didn't take a lot, but just gives a bit of an effect there. Okay, have a rest and a break if you want. Where are you here? We're just putting in some of the shadows into the snowy side, the dark sides of the darker side of the snow mountain, and coming down into these purpley rocks. And I put a little bit of purple and cobalt in. So we're gradually pulling together the distant effects of the cools and the warms, the different blues and reflected light. See, there isn't a lot of shadow today anyway, so we'll start with our lights and we finish with our darks. So you see I'm starting off with my lighter colours and gradually going darker and darker and darker as I go along. I've been using my mop all the way through, but I'm going to change in a minute when the paint's a little bit drier here to a little sword brush that I like to use for this sort of work here. Let that dry off there, and while that's drying, while this area is drying here, because it needs to be a bit tighter, I'm going to come down to these areas of grass here and very, very loosely paint them in. I'm going to come in with the raw sienna again, and they're quite warm, some of these, so we'll come down with all that warmth. That pathway comes up through here. It's a very warm green, these sorts of almost heathery, dry, brackeny stuff here. And remember, when you're painting normally, not a rule, but normally we go warm, cooler, cooler, cooler. So as I come to these rocks and things here, they're going to be quite warm at the edges in their strengths. A bit of dry brushwork down here we'll play with as well. It's a £300 knot paper, this one, so I can afford to do a little bit of dry brushwork with it. I don't like using mixed greens until the end, that is pre-made greens. I prefer to make my own up as much as possible. You learn far more about colour and paint that way. So I'm going to now add some cobalt to that same raw sienna, which will give me, so there's the cobalt into this one, there's the sienna into that one, a little bit more cobalt, which gives me a rather muddy green but quite a nice one for this. And I'm going to actually have to put some even warmer colour into that yet, because the sun is shining quite brightly on this heathery stuff out here. You see we're getting some lovely colours to play with already in this. It's quite subtle colouring. It's using the earth palette mostly. Bring that down to there. And as it dries, of course we get harder edges. So I've got my softer edges in the background. Now I'm starting to paint in these slightly harder edges as the foreground comes tighter towards us. Now those greens blend up there into the background, come down here with these figures up. Go a bit stronger now. So I'm playing wet next to wet and wet into wet, but it's all, as watercolour always is, to do with control. As to how wet the paint in, as to what you can put in when. See how rapid it is. I want to go even stronger there with those ochres, and not just the ochre, but I'm going to add a little touch of Indian red. Come down into these warms down here, especially down here. That path is more purple, so I'll come in with that path again in a moment. And those reds are just coming around here. Strongly through that. Back to the raw sienna, stronger still with it as we come forward here. I'm going to want to go a bit more orangey yellow as I come around this heathery stuff. The only way I can do that now, because I've gone as yellow as I can with the raw sienna, will be to bring in a touch of cadmium orange, which is a lovely rich. You want to go down to that? This one in the corner here, look. Cadmium orange, which is a lovely rich yellow. You see what that does to it, it really makes it glow. Don't make it too much, that's just enough coming in there. Now, around these bits of rock here in the foreground, it's quite warm. And I don't want to use bright reds, I'm going to come back to my Indian red again, and the cadmium orange, and just let some of that warmth flow in and around here. Before I put some cool blues and purples next to it to really make it stand out. So we're going from warm to cooler to cooler. Now I need to work on this pathway. I'm going to go back to my ultramarine, lay some of that down here. Don't want to make it look like a river, so we'll put a little bit of purple with it, a little bit of rose with it as well. Bring that up. It really is quite strong up here. All these chunks of rock are sticking up. I'll go even darker into that later, but when I put the darks in it'll make more sense. These are still my light and mid-tones, remember, that I'm working on here. the strata of the rock coming through. These blues that are happening right back through. So we've almost covered the paper. We really want to get rid of all this white paper as soon as we can. A bit more rose amongst the rock bits there. Really make that sing a bit. And going down that path. Let's feel the edges of these bits of stone a little bit. Well, the tones are a lot darker than I've got down there to make the snow shine out, so I'm going to have to start now to make some much darker bits of rock to go amongst these lighter colours to make them work. Let's start with some burnt sienna. Come back up to these rocks here that are in shadow and add some ultramarine to the burnt sienna. Get a really dark purpley brown in there and around the edges of these. Just feel a way around some of these rocks here. I'll go even darker into those later, but not quite yet. Right, let that dry a moment. I need to go back up to these bits, and I'm going to change my brushes again now to a little sword, 1/4 inch sword that's now disappeared down by my ankle. Now putting in the darker shadows and bits of rock up into the hillside here, which should really bring out these effects of the light intensity of the snow. A little bit of rose again with the ultramarine, and we'll play with these striations in the snow and start to feel the edges of some of these areas of the hills which we haven't got anything else to work with. There's no other shadow today. Now you can see we're working down the darker areas and gradually making the snow stand out a bit more. We can afford to putting 1 or 2 more dark bits up in the mountain here as well now. Just little touches here and there to help make it stand out. Yeah, feel free to come from this and back up to the scene again once or twice as well. That's something we haven't been doing and should have been doing.
I have done now.
What I'm going to do now is get a bit of sponge and just texture some of these areas around here a bit more to be different from the path. I feel we've lost texture a bit, and if we have the detail in the foreground and the warmth in the foreground and the softness in the background, it gives us more a feeling of distance. Two different sponges I've got here. Look, you can see that the textures on them both much finer and quite rough. Let's start with the rough one and do a bit about the pathway here. See how nice and gravelly that makes that down there, look. Just loosely. It's only an indication we want that something else is happening there other than... I'll just brush it a bit there to get the feeling of grass. And then we use the finer one in a minute to just do a little bit of these grassy effects down here. Now the colour I'll mix with the brush to make a deep green this time. Take some Prussian. Wow, that's indigo actually, but it'll do. Let's see what I can do with a little bit of that. Give us a little bit of texture. If not to overdo it or make the same marks as well, you've got to keep moving the sponge around so you get a different mark. A little bird friend singing in the distance. Just take it up there a little bit. And that painting is about done as far as I'm concerned. I'm going to put a few little details here. The small round brush. Put my brushes away. No, I'll use the little sword again. Just want a few blades of grassy bits here. So we'll mix some burnt sienna with that deep bluey green. I just want to play here a little at the corner. Just going to put a little bit of white gouache back into here where I've lost some of the snow. Well, I just feel like splashing some about down here just to balance out this area. Just got a bit too even for me, so I just want to bring some whites back in there a fraction. That just helps to break it a bit. There can be a little touch like that that can make or break a painting. I've got to play with the snow down here a bit again as well, just a bit more snow amongst these bits. Now, I wasn't using any resist. I can afford to allow myself the luxury of a little bit of white gouache here and there. That'll do.
In exploring the areas around the Sierra Nevada mountains, we found some wonderful little villages, and there they're making local produce as well. In some of the homes I looked at with the possibility of purchasing, we found in the attics they were curing their own hams. In this particular village we had a sample of this, and my word, it was certainly very delicious. This particular scene proved to be a very difficult one to paint. We had the best of both worlds. We had the foreground, the middle distance and distance, but this vast valley in between, and then perched high up the hillside a small white village with the mountains and snow behind. Not an easy scene to paint at all, as I was to discover. But you can see the comfort of using the little three-legged stool and my easel here, and how lightly I can travel, and I can sit almost anywhere on a perch on a mountainside, a few rocks or a platform, or just a nice pleasant meadow or by the seaside. With the board upside down, I'm starting off with a wash of raw sienna for the sky, and then dropping in a mixture of burnt sienna and ultramarine in order to give this feeling of the stormy clouds coming over the top of the snow. And that enables me to tilt the board so that the paint can run down, giving these effects of a slightly rainy, cloudy, thundery sky. Of course you have to be careful how much wet you drop in, because if it's too much then it will just turn into one big blobby mess. But while the paint is wet you can keep dropping areas in delicately with the tip of the brush, just tickling the paper until you get the effects you want. And we're working dark against light, rough against smooth, cool against warm even still. So this very dark sky will enable the snow to shine out more brightly, as if we've got patches of sunlight coming through. When you're working outdoors, in order to catch the mood in the moment and of course work in between the weather conditions, you have to work very quickly. So the techniques I'm showing you here for watercolour are very, very rapid, and you gain very quick and instant and pleasing effects. The liquid watercolour I'm using in my palettes will have hardened up, so when I'm travelling and in between they aren't going to make a mess. When I wish to use them, a few minutes before I start painting, I dab a little water onto each one just to soften the surface and make them usable. As you can see here, by simply using those three colours of raw sienna, burnt sienna and ultramarine, we can make quite an effective sky. Then we start to work up the delicate colours of the background and foreground, putting on pale washes of the raw sienna and working down to the brighter yellows of aureolin yellow and perhaps a little chrome. Then adding in some rose and some of the stronger warms as we go along with the burnt sienna. You'll notice too how soon we start to work the sharp edges against the soft edges, the lost and found edges you might say, with the wet into wet and wet next to wet of the background to give the atmosphere and effects of the blending of distant hillsides and grasses and rocks. Now as I start to come up to the mountains and the darker areas of shadow and rocks against those brighter areas of snow, I've let the paint dry and I'm using the wet paint onto dry paper or dry paint to give harder edges. In the darks I've gone back to my mix of the ultramarine and the burnt sienna, and you could actually make a painting like this only using a limited palette of mainly those three colours. And you'll notice the usual watercolour techniques here when glazing, of laying one colour over another of exactly the same colour and intensity, but when you repeat it, of course it's twice as dark because there's twice the thickness of layer. So if I put on some light coloured rocks and then when it's dry go over again with the same paint, it will look twice as dark. And if I do that over the dry paint, it will have a hard edge, as I'm doing now with these rocks again on the mountain top. You can see how the sky has now dropped down as the board has been tilted, and I've allowed the water and paint, while it's still wet, to be drawn down by gravity, which gives that rather lovely soft furry effect against the more harder areas of the rocks on the snow below. Gradually building up these layers of washes of watercolour, in some places working wet into wet and wet next to wet so we get the soft edges and blending, and then in some areas working these wet over dries to get the slightly harder edges, so we can get the feel of soft snow blending into the grasses and the feel of the harder rocks against the softer areas of shale. As we move from the background towards the foreground, you'll notice my colours get warmer and warmer and stronger in many cases. Usually the atmosphere means that the distance is cooler and the foreground warmer. The only real exception to this might be a sunset, where it's very warm in the background and cooler in the foreground. So we go usually from the focus in the foreground and detail in the foreground, as you see here, to getting more and more out of focus in the background because of the amount of water in the atmosphere, these little tiny water droplets. And the damper the atmosphere, the more misty it is, and the less you can see into the distance, and the less detail you see in the distance, and also the warmer it is in the foreground and the cooler it is in the distance. Watch your variety of greens as well. We can have warm and cools of almost any colour. We can have warm and cool blues going from the cerulean through to the ultramarine. We can have the greens here which go from very bluey greens, as you see, to my now warmer colours in the foreground. For cool greens we might mix up cerulean and some aureolin yellow. For these warmer greens obviously we'll use the warmer yellows and the warmer blues to make the green. So we could be using yellow ochre or raw sienna with some ultramarine blue, or we might be using some chrome yellow and ultramarine. That would also give us a lovely warm green. At this stage we are starting to work some of the surface texture into the foreground, the strata of the rocks and these rather scrubby pieces of brushwood and herbs. Okay, having seen these techniques of using washes and then glazes, let's move on to the stages of a painting, looking down over a village scene like this of these little white houses with the red roofs. I shan't show you the entire painting, but I'll just show you the stages of it being produced. It's quite a complicated composition, so it takes a fairly careful piece of drawing at the beginning. And if we have a fairly careful piece of drawing, then we can work loosely into it. We can work as loosely as we want, gradually building it up. Again, starting with the sky here, and working down through the mountains, and working wet against wet to get the effect of the distant mist in between the mountain layers. Leaving the white areas for the houses, not masking this time, and then gradually working the glazes and washes up in exactly the same method as you saw me using just now, until we have this finished painting. In this particular case I've decided to take in almost the whole scene, and I haven't made a vignette. A vignette is where you have it blurry towards the edges. It may even have been better to have done that with this painting and blurred the edges of this, concentrating more on the focal areas in the centre. You can't always have your sketchbook handy and have the speed of ease to use it, so digital cameras for me are very useful, and I can take or leave whatever shots I want to use later. Well, before we continue with our next painting, again looking over another village scene, let's take another walk up through these beautiful lanes of poppies and brightly coloured flowers, the bees humming and buzzing around and butterflies flitting. Now this sort of scene is an ideal one for the use of watercolour and then pastels over the top. To have to mask out all those red flowers would be a real nuisance. So we can paint it in watercolour or an acrylic background, and then we could work the pastels for the bright flowers over the top, or we could use acrylics over the top for the bright flowers as well. And of course we can leave out whatever we want when we're painting. We don't have to put these power cables in. We can change composition slightly. We can move a tree a little bit more to the right or left. Constable certainly did this in his paintings. If you look at the Haywain, for instance, some of those trees are still standing to this day. The oak trees last hundreds of years, and you will see that the scene does differ from his compositions. A tree might be 30 to 40 yards moved to one side, because it's what happens in the painting that matters in the end. You'll notice in this particular painting that I have done what I said earlier about the vignette. I've concentrated towards the centre of this painting and left it softer and more blurred at the edges, especially to the left, so that the eye is led in at the right hand corner, and then the scene peters out and softens out into the distance. Keep looking at the diversity of the types of scene we can do, and therefore the types of medium we can use. A street scene like this could be wonderful for very loose brushwork with those big flats. You might want to actually sit there and paint that, or use photographs later on. Having objects like this in the foreground, the lamps, the trees, or taking a quick shot looking through something like that to figures behind, so you've got foreground, middle distance, distance. Using perspective here, the boat in the foreground and then the marshes going into the background. Here we've got some sandfire, the edible seaweed that we find around the East Yorkshire coast here in England and in many parts of marshes in England. Marshes being wonderful places to paint as well, to give this expanse of reflection and light. But again, the foreground, middle distance, distance. Don't be afraid to zoom in on things in your painting. Don't make little tiny boats in the distance, the odd little speck in a corner of a page. Come right in onto a shape and a form by all means. And how would you paint a scene like this? But look at the recession of those ripples, how the large ripples in the foreground turn into smaller ones and get closer together as they go into the distance. the way that we can use this line of seaweed and flotsam to lead our eye back into the distance here. Scale, foreground, middle distance, distance there of the boat. And the interaction and the play of light. It could be wonderful to take a still shot of that and treat it with very hard edges and very photographically to give an almost abstract feel. But to get the feeling of movement and light and rippling on water, we often need to use a more vigorous brushstroke, a more gestural brushstroke to get the feeling of that movement rather than it looking like plastic foam or than real foam. The flight of this bird is an example of that. If we painted the bird with hard-edged wings, it might look as if it was stuck onto the paper, but as we see here, this slight blurring of the wings gives the feeling of motion. The use of a figure in a picture can make a boring scene into quite an interesting and exciting one. Here that person picking cockles up makes quite a nice scene. The use of composition is vital. Those octopus pots there, from the largest to the smallest going into the background. The way here that I'm showing the larger boats in the foreground and smaller ones in the background so the eye is led through. That boat lying there upside down and the larger one behind. Choosing pleasing angles, the way that one thing leads into another and the eye is led through the picture, or like a snake around, weaving its way in and out of the composition. Here we see a stork feeding, and on top of that chimney in the distance, its nest. And like a Dutch landscape, just look at this wonderful cloud effect. We've got very little in the foreground and it's all flat, but then into the background, these wonderful big clouds that could be done with the use of a pastel sideways on, a nice big wet into wet watercolour. And I can't resist taking out my little collapsible rod to have a go at some fishing here and there. This nice big mullet made a wonderful evening dinner. Let's concentrate on some street scenes now. As you see, some of these Spanish villages are absolutely wonderful for this, with these narrow, winding staircases. The wonderful terracotta roofs and whitewashed walls give us plenty of scope to play with both shape and, of course, tone, where we have the lights and darks reflecting into the walls and the sun shining on them directly. And because of the shapes too, it allows us to use the flat brushes a lot more. And the use of these flat brushes very loosely, in conjunction with the mop and the round brushes, can be extremely effective. Now this can of course be done by masking fluid, or we can leave those areas out if they're larger and paint around them. With very few exceptions, I found that as an artist I've been readily accepted in nearly every country I've been painting in, and in fact the locals find you a great interest, and you're not threatening, and of course you're showing an interest in their environment. Let's have a go at painting a small street scene now. This figure coming down was rapidly sketched in, and the way of working with this sort of painting I learnt from a New Zealand artist who worked on huge paintings in this sort of way. Not in the way you would expect. He tended to paint in the salient features, the areas that he was going to focus on, the important points first. Not in great detail, still trying to keep it fairly loose and using technique and method. And this is where those wonderful sword brushes come in handy for painting figures, because you can just flick down a leg with one stroke of a brush, twisting it as you go. They're wonderful brushes for this sort of work. At first I thought they were a bit too techniquey, but having seen him use them, found them very, very, very good. And in fact, with a painting like this, the materials are very important, the choice of them. Here I'm using a 300-pound rough paper, and find that that texture and the heavy weight of paper allows me to do washes and then dry brushwork over the top. Also, as I was saying, the use of the different brushes is very important. I learnt that a medium stiff brush is vital for this particular kind of work. We can use the soft brushes for doing the washes and the small round brushes for doing these sorts of details, but the flats that I'm going to use are actually fairly stiff, so that I can do quite lively, loose dry brushwork over the surface. As you see here, I've produced quite a light, lively drawing, not too much detail, but tight enough that I know where everything's going to go. It's something you keep hearing me saying, but if you start loose you can finish tight, but if you start tight you can't go looser. Yes, we can have a fairly tight drawing because you can work as loosely within that drawing as you wish, but if you get bound down by that, you'll find that you get a very, very tight painting and you cannot come back on it. In fact, the only way you can deal with an overworked watercolour, apart from washing it back, cleaning it off, is to work pastel over the top. Again, even when I'm doing details like the edge of this roof, you see I'm working fairly loosely. I'm not trying to paint every detail, and I'm giving an indication and gradually building up on those indications. I am the one that's in control. I'm the artist, therefore I can stop when I want. I'm not trying to produce a photograph. I'm not trying to produce an illustration. I'm working about the beauty of the paint, the fluidity of watercolour, the looseness of those shapes that can be achieved, and the textures and surfaces. You really do need rapid techniques when you're working out of doors, unless you're going to be able to paint day after day and go back to the same spot in exactly the same light. Animals will move, people move, the light changes, the time of day changes. So the way that I'm working here, this very fast and loose way, enables you to achieve a quick painting, yet still end up with as much detail as you require. Perhaps a good way to work on a more complicated painting is to think about it as being a jigsaw, that you're going to put the jigsaw together in pieces, almost like painting by numbers, but not quite. If we imagine that every piece of colour is a different shape, and that these pieces of colour are placed relative one next to another, with the right shapes, the right tones and the right colours, then the jigsaw will just fit together and your painting will simply appear. And this is a bit what I'm doing here. I'm relating one colour in the right shapes next to each other. There's more to it than that, because we're looking at the right tones and we're looking at textures, we're being loose, we're letting the paper glow and shine through in places, and gradually building up and tightening up as I go along. You can see now that I've painted in the most important parts of the painting, the salient points, the details, and I'm now going in with my nice big soft oval wash brush, putting in a good layer of wet paint so that I can work wet into wet on the surface and gradually tighten up as the paint dries. Keep the brushwork nice and loose, nice and delicate. Just flick your brush over the shapes, gently touch them and dab them into the wet and control where the wet is going over the dry. You'll notice that I started with quite light washes and that my paint is gradually getting stronger and stronger, not only stronger with the colours but stronger in the pigment, the amount of actual paint I'm putting into the wet My colours are quite pale in the background and cooler, and the warms become warmer and warmer as they come into the foreground. Even in a short space, even in a short passageway like this, we will have some atmosphere and we need to get the feeling of depth. The colours that I'm using start with fairly muted colours of raw sienna and burnt sienna and the ultramarine, and gradually I'll work up stronger colours. I'll be coming through to my cadmium oranges and my Prussian blues and indigos for the very, very dark colours. You see here I'm just indicating the darks and the shapes. I'm not going into every little detail around the windows. The idea is just to give an indication, an impression of colours. But of course blocks of tone are very important here. and you get this wonderful lovely loose effect by just flicking and dragging the brush across this rough paper. It's such an unshackled way of working. It's so lovely, loose, light and free. It doesn't make you feel bound up by all the details that are there, by having to paint every little bit of dirt on the road or every bit of fur on the cat. As I repeat, we're not doing an illustration, we're making a painting. It's about the paint, it's about the light, it's about our emotions and feelings about the place. And we have to reflect our emotions and feelings about the place in the way we're working. Gradually we work up to more and more detail, gradually we work up from our lightest tones through to our darkest, and we start to add texture more here and there where we didn't do it originally with the finer detail. So we can work into the shadows in and around that bush, and down little bits of window, and down the texturing of a doorway. Even the shadows have to be put in exactly the same lively, loose way. If we go too pedantic with them, then the whole painting will tighten up or they'll stand up like a sore thumb. Let's come on to the shutters here now. We'll start with this wash and then work wet into wet. And we'll come back into that wet into wet at first with one of my flat brushes. You can see how we can just indicate in all of those difficult, you might feel, and pedantic little shutters. We're just going to get the feeling of them. We're not going to paint every single one in. And as the paint dries, we gradually control the way that we flick in the darker areas on top. Still using a flat here and just working in all of these little details of edges of doors, edges of windows, and edges of the shutter. This way of working gives you a nice coherence. Basically you're making the atmosphere first, forming the structure of the painting, getting all of the tones right and the relative colours, and then you're gradually picking out salient points and details that you didn't do with your original salient points. You could of course do this painting with more limited palette. I've used a fairly broad palette with this and played the warm and cools reflecting into the building, played the light yellows and creams against the cooler blue shadows, but still leaving plenty of light paper showing through, keeping it nice and lively. With painting anything white, you've really got to look for the colours, because we're not going to just paint greys, we're going to try and use clean, light, reflected colours into those white surfaces. It's useful to have that digital camera nearby, or your camera nearby, because if a figure does just what has happened there and goes through, or an animal comes into the scene and you want to capture it, and you haven't got time to change to a sketch pad, or your memory is as bad as mine, then it's useful to be able to just take a quick snapshot. The beauty of the digital is that I can then immediately put it back on the camera on the back of the screen and paint it in from the camera if I wish. I've done this actually even in planning paintings out, taken a few shots of figures beforehand and then sat there doing the painting and using the digital camera to add those figures during my time there. Here's an ideal example, this figure walking up, and in fact I use this figure later on for a second painting in the studio of this particular scene. Back to the shutters again, and a few little bits of tidying up and just touching around some of the areas, a few little details and final points just to bring the eye into focus, and there's our finished painting. Not only lively and loose, but the point is great fun to do, and I think that shows in a painting like this that you have enjoyed doing it. Here's a quick study done just outside the front door of where I was staying in Besnar, only about 15 minutes, but you see how I've kept it lively and loose and just flicked in those telegraph wires and electric cables, not to become an eyesore, but to help link the shapes together. We have to decide which medium we're going to use for subject matter, and just look at these wonderful scenes. The poppies growing up the banks, going down into the valley from Besnar towards the lake. These springtime flowers are absolutely gorgeous, but these actually possibly would make very nice acrylics. They'd certainly make lovely oil paintings on canvas. If you were going to tackle them with watercolour, then you might prefer to use the watercolour and pastel over the top. We'll do an example of this shortly so you can see how I would do that. But pastel over acrylic or pastel over watercolour can give you some wonderful, bright and lively effects. Don't be afraid to use mixed medium. Obviously there's a lovely challenge in using traditional methods, but you shouldn't be held back by that. Scenes like this, go around with your digital camera and look how wonderful these would be with acrylic inks, the lovely brights of the inks, the pastels over the top, the richness of watercolour used fairly heavily or acrylics underneath. Choose the medium to suit the scene. And again I say, keep your camera with you, your little digital or your snap camera, and having a sketch pad handy all of the time is very, very useful. Just consider the infinite variety of ways that we could produce these paintings, from scraping through with wax, with watercolour over the top resisting, with opaque paints, with impasto paints, with transparent paints, the mixing of any of these mediums together into mixed medium, the use of the Chinograph pencil I'm going to show you soon, and then watercolour over that, and then pastel over that. There's so many wonderful ways and lively and loose ways to work. Collecting resource for when you get back home is important as well. It may be at the time you can't think of painting a particular subject matter there and then, but of course when you get back to the studio you might want to paint a horse, or you might want to put a composite picture together. Okay, let's do a step by step now, showing you how we can use watercolour and pastel over the top. We could build up a traditional watercolour, we might be happy with that, nice and lively and loose. All of these yellow flowers could be masked out and painted in later, or they could be splattered in with opaque paint such as acrylic over the top, or in this case we're going to use pastels over the top to get this vibrancy and brightness. Again, a nice lively and loose way of working, just building up from my lights to my darks, starting with the aureolin yellows and working up into the roses and cadmiums, working some of the rose into the cadmium yellow gives me a nice bright red, brighter in fact than cadmium red, although the colour bright red is one that I like very much now. So here's the basic foundation watercolour completed and built up, but it looks a little bit dry and dead. Some people would find that fine, but the beauty of working this way is that we can work our lights over our darks. We don't have to leave all those lights behind. We can go back into this and brighten the colours up. We can work around the dark edges and we can put darks back in as well, so we can work both ways. Now, I've had many students come to me who want to loosen up with their watercolours. They've got very traditional, they've got very tight, and they want to find looser ways of working. And this is one direction I take them. What often happens is that they'll loosen up so much, be so unafraid of working nice and loosely and in a lively way, that they won't even need to get to the pastels. I'll stop them at that stage and say, hey, take a look at what you've just done. Oh wow, this is a lovely loose watercolour. How did I do that? Because you didn't worry about all of these little bits of tight drawing and masking fluid and techniques. You just went in there and thoroughly enjoyed. Obviously you can come on and work up the pastel afterwards, as I'm doing here, and if you've got a failed watercolour, then this way of working pastel over the top is ideal. If you've overworked a watercolour, it can quite often be brought back beautifully by working pastel up over the surface. I prefer to use a smooth paper. In this case I'm using an Arches Hot Press 140 because that smooth surface, the texture does not get in my way. If you want an orange peel texture, for instance for something like a snow scene where the texture can be very, very useful on the surface, that's fine, but often the texture gets in the way and fights the actual painting. This is another good reason for having a coloured ground down already. To use coloured papers is risky because nearly all coloured papers are not colour fast or light fast, and if you're doing a pastel over a coloured Ingres paper, later on the colour will change. But if you've actually painted the paper with a thin coat of acrylic or poster paint or even acrylic ink, that colour should be colour fast, so your values won't change in the years to come. Your painting will still be as fresh as the time you made it. Using watercolour should be the same, although watercolour can fade if put in strong light. Generally speaking, those colours are going to be far more permanent than a coloured paper. So here you can see we can put all of these lovely bits of bright sky back in again, shining through the darker areas of watercolour, and we can make the flowers much more vibrant. Something to remember with this technique is that you need to paint the watercolours more heavily than you would normally do. If you paint a very delicate light watercolour, the pastel will stand out like a sore thumb. You must go in much, much more boldly, as you can now see here with the watercolour to start with. You must work much more deeply and darkly and almost more opaquely as a whole to make this work. But I'm going to show you other examples in the next few minutes where we do use a watercolour a bit more lightly and very, very lively, and just bring in some of the darks and highlights with the pastel. Sometimes you might only need 1 or 2 strokes with the pastel to make a painting work. But look at the advantages of this, how loosely we can work without fear. If we make a mistake, we can go over it again. We can actually turn it into an entire pastel. We don't have to leave any paint at all if we don't want to. Or we can just make a few strokes and leave it nearly all paint. But we have the choice, and we can put in the lights and darks as we wish. It's a great way to paint a complicated flower painting, and I've been developing the use of acrylic inks with this as well, especially when I've been doing that work at Burton Agnes, the stately home, where we have extremely bright and vibrant gardens, and to capture that effect I've used the much stronger acrylic inks as watercolours in the same technique, and then used pastels over the top. The only real difference is, apart from their colour intensity, is that when they're dry they're waterproof, so you have to keep them wet with a fine spray whilst you're still working wet into wet. And here we have our finished piece, which I think captures this quite complicated but delicate scene. Now let's move on to using the Chinograph pencil and working a pastel over that. Again, we're using the smooth hot press paper, the 140-pound Arches, going in with this Chinograph pencil. One of the beauties of this type of pencil is that you don't have to sharpen it. You can just peel away the paper at the lower edge and reveal the lead quite simply without having to take a knife out when you're working very rapidly. I use a nice lively approach to this, almost a sculptural approach, and I want this whole painting to be nice and delicate and lively, so I'm working in my aureolin yellows very quickly in all my light colours, and then we'll work up my washes delicately and fast and loosely, gradually building up them with some pastels over the top at the end. Keep it nice and fresh, just blob the colours in, don't be too detailed, don't worry about counting out every single orange. We're going to just go for this loose effect and then we can tighten up later if we wish. But in working in this way we'll probably turn out with a very lively loose piece of work rather than being too concerned about being exact. be very aware of the different greens, of course. We need to look at our warm and cool greens to get the effect of sunlight, working from the yellows right through to then the cooler colours as the blues come into the yellows to make the various greens. And here we are playing that very thing, the warm greens against the cool greens, and letting that sunlight shine through. This video, of course, is called Every Which Way and Loose, and that is exactly what we're about, painting loosely here and enjoying, and those paintings should reflect our pleasure and that enjoyment. Remember the tools to our armoury: light against dark, warm against cool, rough against smooth. So as we go on playing those different greens together, now we'll bring the warms in, and we'll start to play the warms against the cooler greens to make them even stronger. And taking that a stage further, we'll move on to pushing some purple, deep purples and blues to push the shadows against those warms to really make them sing. And as the watercolour stage of this painting is completed, we'll work into our darks more so that the painting is more tonal, and those lighter areas start to glow as sunlight between the dark shadows. Okay, now we're ready to bring the pastels in. Here's our completed painting. Now let's start to bring in the bright areas of sunlight that are catching in between, working over some of these darker watercolours we've got, bringing out these wonderful patches, these puddles of light that are shining between the branches onto the ground. Enjoy yourself, for heaven's sake. That is what painting is about. It's not about being better than the person next to you in the Art Society. It's not necessarily about winning the Art Society prize. It is more about you gaining confidence, enjoying your painting, improving, but just finding pleasure in the whole process. You'll only improve by taking risks. You can't move forward without trying something new, and of course you're going to make mistakes doing that. But if you experiment, you'll probably turn out the best work of your life. Just listen to this nightingale singing in the background. Here he is, just above us. Let's work with this Chinagraph pencil a bit more. What you'll notice here is that the Chinagraph pencil is fairly waterproof, but by using some water on it and blending with the brush or smudging with your finger, you can actually move some of that pencil and manipulate it almost sculpturally. You might enjoy doing this so much that you don't even bother putting paint on, just make a really nice, lively, loose drawing, a very expressive drawing. This is a very expressive way of working, a very expressionist way of working, because I'm going in really loosely and feeling those branches and sculpting them out, and then working in with the brush and building up with colour and finally building up with some of the pastel. Now what I'm going to show you here is what very few people seem to realise, that soft pastels blend with water. You can actually use a brush on a soft pastel and take paint off or pigment off the pastel and paint it straight onto the paper. But let's say for instance we were going to paint the trunk of the tree with a dark pastel, and the pastels were so heavy and large that we had a job painting little twigs. We could take a wet brush and drag out the pastel that's on the paper into the thinner twigs. Here you're going to see me putting water onto the paper now, and then adding the pastel onto that water. Again, we're using 140 pound smooth hot press arches, and you can then wash that pigment in. Here we go, there's the water. Now I put some turquoise on the top, and you can see with my fingers or with a brush I can just blend it straight into the water. Again, it's very sculptural, it's very tactile. It's a wonderful way to work. I've used this when working in a thunderstorm, in a total rainstorm up in the Hebrides, where the paper was just totally soaked, and all I had to do was blend the pastel into the surface of the wet paper, use my brush to move it around, and as the rain actually slowed down I was able to tighten up as the paper dried out. And of course you can mix and blend the pastel as you go along onto the wet paper. Now, pastel that's been wet, when it dries, is fixed, so this enables me then to add further coats on when the pastel is dry that won't smudge. For this type of work, the better quality of pastel, the better this will work. So the softer the pastel, usually the higher quality and usually the more expensive. I thoroughly recommend the Unison pastels, the Yorkshire-made Unisons. I find their pigment and range of colours to be wonderful, very permanent and just the right texture for this kind of work. And so we come to the closing stages of the painting, where you can see we've been building up onto the wet paper, and as it dries out we can gradually become stronger with our pigment, and in fact it almost becomes a straightforward pastel, although the dark pencil is showing through. And here we see how we build up the brighter colours on top, putting our nice sunlit greens and lighter areas shining through the trees on at the very end. So we've now shown you several techniques, quite different in the way that they're used, using water-based mediums, but exploring different approaches to the way we can put over the feelings that we have about the subject in front of us. Most of my work is done in situ. I prefer to work from life if possible, but a subject matter like this would be almost impossible. You could use a sketch pad, and you could do quick studies, certainly, but to have my digital handy, or even this video camera from which I took this shot, and then did this watercolour later on in the studio. I've used masking fluid for the stamens, and then all of the rest is painted in straight watercolour. We're going to do a more traditional pastel now. Here I've used the £140 hot press paper. You would think that pastel wouldn't take to that paper, but actually it takes very well, especially when you've got a ground on it or you've already used watercolour. So we've got the smooth hot press £140 paper, not stretched out, simply taped down with ordinary masking tape, so we don't even need to wet and stretch the paper. It's being coated with a mixture of deep blue acrylic ink and a little mauve. When that's dry, then we can work very rapidly with a light pastel to sketch out a composition and build up the layers of pastel by blending, blocking and blending. Now pastel works by the reflection of light on the small particles of the pigment. If you smudge it, you squash down those little particles and it deadens it. So the important thing with a pastel is that the last coats must be fresh, left alone and not touched at all. I don't even like to fix my pastels. I used to, but I find that in fact it takes the light colours down a few tones and deadens the thing. If we use a nice big double mount and the glass is well away from the pastel won't usually come away too much anyway. Always store your pastels with the face upwards. You can use newspaper or better still greaseproof paper in between pastels for storage or for travelling and roll them. So you'll see here I'm gradually building up these layers of pastel, just scumbling them on the surface. My pastels have the paper removed. This means that I can use the pastel sideways on, again much more freely, and I don't get into doing little tiny details and dots and dashes with the end of the pastel. Smaller pastels are a bit of a difficulty for this because they can just crumble in your hand or fall apart when you take the paper off. Again, the reason I like these larger unisons is because they're nice and solid, they're a good texture, and they very seldom crumble on you, and they're so versatile. So we build up, leaving the blue ground showing through. The acrylic ink blue ground is colour fast, so I know it's not going to change later. And you can choose the coloured ground that you want for the mood and atmosphere of your painting, especially if you're doing a still life. Or red is a wonderful colour for having for a landscape as well, because the red glows through against the greens. You notice in Constable's paintings, in nearly all of his landscapes, somewhere in the painting he'll have a little red figure. Why? Because it's the opposite in the colour circle to green, and the red brings out the intensity of the greens. What you can't see here is the strength of the wind. I'm sitting on my little three-legged stool with my easel again, nice and comfortably, only a piece of hardboard as my main drawing board. But there's about a 4, 7 or 8 gale blowing there, so I'm having to hold the picture down with my left arm whilst working with my right. It's not the most difficult situation I've worked in. Probably the strongest wind I've worked in was up painting the Matterhorn when I came out of the top of the railway there into about a force 8 or 9 with only a t-shirt on, not realising how cold it was. And of course people were up there with the snow gear. But I still succeeded in doing an acrylic painting by putting boulders on my palette and almost taking off with the canvas in the wind, but most enjoyable. You never know when you're going to find a wonderfully traditional scene. This goat herd bringing his flock down through the valley there and across the water. Wonderful scene to capture with the camera and do some studies of later in watercolour. And the rivers and lakes there are teeming with fish. There's so much insect life, and of course the water's warm for most of the year, that they grow very, very quickly there and extremely prolific. These fish are called grass carp, and they provided me with entertainment not only with a fishing rod briefly, but also look at the wonderful reflections. And I decided to use one of these shots later to play with these patterns and shapes that were made by the surface of the water reflecting the light from the sky. And then we put him back, unharmed and none the worse for wear, but a bit wiser next time to being caught by a fisherman as silly as me. We've seen watercolour used transparently, we've seen it used a bit more heavily and pastel over the top, but as I'm using these liquid watercolours they can be used more opaquely. It seems a shame in a way because we're probably better off using poster paint for that, but here I've started the watercolour traditionally, using it transparently and fairly thinly, and then building up heavier layers over the top to try and get a deeper richness of the paint using the liquid watercolours. It's the type of painting that you could later use and take further. I mean, wouldn't this make a wonderful piece of fabric or tapestry even, or possibly even a silkscreen print? And from the sublime to the ridiculous, we've just looked at using watercolour very opaquely. Now let's look at the opposite end of using it very delicately, of building up very delicate light washes, very pale colours, and then gradually strengthening up, but not going too far with it. Here we've got this lovely little leafy alleyway, this corridor going up underneath a tree with stone walls each side. I did two studies. This first one was a little bit tighter, and as you often find with a watercolour, once you've got into it, once you know the subject, once you've loosened up, you produce a second one that's much better, as I feel I have this time. I really enjoyed the texture of these leaves at the top and decided to mask off both the lighter coloured leaves and some of the highlights of the leaves in the surrounding area, and then build up loosely, lightly, delicately, playing light against dark, warm against cool, and at the very end, when I've got all of the tones sorted, then we'll take off the masking fluid and still work in around some of these light shapes to pull out the layers, the umbrellas of these leaves. So here we can see the use of the warm and cool greens, we can see the light against the darks. This tonal balance is very important, light dark, light dark, light dark, areas of light shining through between leaves, and the textures of the softer areas of light up into that passageway, and then the sharper edges of the foreground leaves, light against dark. You might find this a strange simile, but I do find painting to be a very musical thing, because it's like a symphony of colours, of textures, of light and dark, of cools and warms, of shades, one thing against another, so that the orchestra, each instrument, makes up the whole painting. I'm going to show you a demonstration now on that glass of beer that I took in Spain to show you how we can use acrylics for such an abstraction that I've enhanced from photographs on the computer. Even a simple subject matter like this can be rather fun. In this case I'm using ordinary acrylic paints and a piece of hardboard, and I haven't bothered priming it at all. I'm just going to work the coats of acrylic straight up. Now I want the colours to actually be very flat, almost painting by numbers, absolutely clean, neat, bold shapes, as flat as possible, hardly any texturing when I've finished. It'll become a pattern, almost a jigsaw of lovely colours and shapes. So in this case I'm going to build up the colours on the hardboard, getting the right colour tones, getting the right approximate shapes, and then gradually as the colours become thicker and thicker they become flatter and flatter, and I'll refine the edges of the forms. So working from this photograph I took in Spain of a simple glass of beer, and you can see what you can do by digitising and making it into a more interesting picture, even from something so banal. I've already started the acrylic paint onto this. As I say, I want to give a nice layer of paint, a nice flat surface in the end. I shall be doing a little bit of glazing. Acrylic is so versatile. Acrylic we can use like watercolour. We can put a layer on thinly, we can put a layer on thickly, we can glaze over it after it's dry, we can put it on impasto like oil paint, we can brush it, we can palette knife it, all sorts of ways we can use it. Now you can see I've already got a layer of white on here, and I'm going to put a bit more white on just to show you how flat it will then go with a second layer. So here we go. It's quite thin, this Acaldo acrylic, and one of the reasons I like it is because it can be built up. It's very versatile, but it doesn't dry too quickly. One of the things I found with some acrylics is that they do tend to dry so fast, and I was using it in Switzerland once, and it was actually drying on my brush in between using it from a stay wet palette, so it was still already quite damp, onto the canvas, but the conditions were so hot there that I just couldn't keep it liquid enough. Now this stuff I found even on big canvases tends to give me time to work, and of course once it's dry it's waterproof. So as you can see here, putting the first coat of white on does let the texture show through, and if I wanted to I could almost use a comb on this stuff to let a coloured ground show through here, which could be quite effective depending on what surfaces you want to play with. If we're thinking of something like a braque where there's a lot of wood texture or something, that could be quite fun to do. But you can apply acrylic in so many ways. I mean, we could put it on with a cloth, we could put it on with our fingers, we can put it on with a sponge. It's like oil paint and watercolour combined, it's so versatile. I'm just going to place these colours in approximately the right shapes, and then I'll work over them again later. Because it's an opaque paint as well, I can cut into and around it. I don't have to just have it remaining as it is if I make a mistake. Don't be afraid of computers as well. This business of computer enhancing and playing around with computers to make compositions is great fun, and it gives you more arrows to your bow, it gives you more strength to your armoury. The more ideas you can have for painting with, the more skills you can develop, the better. So why limit yourself to just traditional one-way techniques? And don't be afraid of this new machinery. There are plenty of people out there now willing to help you get started on little lessons and courses. And it doesn't take long, it's compound interest. Once you've learned the basics, it's the same all the way through, it doesn't change. One thing helps another. That's why we've got programs called windows, because one window links to another. And each program has very similar programming. The keyboard does the same things. If I make white, yellow, so white, a little touch of yellow for cream, and a tiny touch of the burnt sienna. I'm trying to get a colour that's very similar to this one here, and you see I'm not far off there. Let's try that. That's about right. I've got to get this first coat on. Takes a fair amount of it the first time through because it is a fairly thin paint, this. I can even blend with it while it's still wet, look. A little bit lighter, a bit more white in there, I've got a feeling. So I put some red, some yellow and a little touch of the brown in. Let's see if that's near. Yes, that's not far out there, look. You see subtleties of colours. That comes right up and through there, links into here. Even a patch of it coming out into there, I'll put it straight in even though the paint's not dry. That's the beauty again, it's not going to spread, it's not going to be like watercolour and leach out. It's very forgiving. And we're gradually finding our colours. Okay, we're going to switch the cameras off for the minute and then come back to this when I've got the basic shapes all painted in and flatter. Well, we've almost reached the stage where I have to come down to painting very finely on this work. All I've got to do is to put in the detail and tidy the edges up. Okay, here we go then. We've done the basic rough painting, the underpainting, without using a primer at all, just simply painting these acrylics straight onto the board. Now I need to make the edges a bit sharper and the colours a little bit clearer and flatter in places. You see the difference that dark colour makes in pushing the lighter one back a bit. And we'll come with that purple down into here as well because this needs tidying up down here. Now an acrylic painting like this it's sunk a lot because the board itself is soaking the colour up. It's going to be a painting that will need some varnish to bring it out, and that's what I'm going to do before I finally frame it. And this colour is coming into the blue in broken areas. So I can use the brush now to tip of the brush to paint in these little broken bits that are in amongst the cloud effects here. It's surprising what a difference little breaks in colour can make like this. Now, just to show you that we can glaze, let's put a little bit of water with this particular colour I'm using and glaze it over the whole thing. So I'm not going to be absolutely flat in my use of colour here. I'm going to glaze a little bit as well, so we can use it a bit like watercolour too, and yet still tighten up edges. So I've got a choice all the time with acrylics. I have the choice to work in a matte way or a transparent way, or to palette knife it on even. I've always got the choice of how I can lay the paint on. Notice there that's a bit darker and more bluer purple coming down into the photograph. So I'm going to add a little bit more of a deeper purple here. I'm working at the end of my brush, you'll notice. I'm getting right back from the painting, not working really close up and in tremendous detail. It's a fair sized painting and I don't want to be trying to paint an illustration. I want a fairly loose stroke. A bit orange in a minute. some of that needs to come down just around as a line around here. Where there are the occasional pencil marks showing, I think I will need to just go over a bit, because I really don't want those still showing, like there for instance, some more white, which is, this white is quite transparent, so it's taking quite a lot of building up to get rid of the earlier pencil marks on the board. I can get something near that grey again. That's better. I don't. There's too much of that. That's it. Of that pink just there. It wants to come out a bit. And you never know where you're going to find resource. Here we visit some local caves, and look how wonderfully these designs could work into a more imaginative composition, perhaps a more illustrative fairy tale type story. Now we'll cross over into Portugal briefly, just across the border from Spain, and look at these wonderful facades on the fronts of the houses. They don't just tile their bathrooms and kitchen, they tile the entire front of a house. And hopefully you'll have noticed that I'm constantly trying to offer you compositions. I take my filming like I would make my paintings. I'm constantly composing pictures that you can either copy from here or will give you stimulation to find ways of working in your own paintings, to see different ways of looking, to see different ways of putting a composition together into that rectangle of paper. We stayed a few nights in a local hotel there, and what a superb situation and environment, what atmosphere and charisma. This 1920s feel to all of the Art Nouveau furniture and windows, and the decoration and design of the place almost took you straight back to that very period. You could sense the feeling of past servants and maids going up and down the stairs, and actually the room we stayed in had very much the feeling of some sort of presence from the past. If you're thinking of taking a visit to the Alhambra, oh my word, it's so wonderful, yes. The architecture the gardens, the landscaping, the amount of work and effort put into the whole thing is absolutely amazing. But do book ahead, either by the internet or telephone, because we had to wait nearly a day in the queue to gain access. Well worth it when we did. Even 2 or 3 square foot of the wonderful work done by those artisans in the past would take me a year or two to produce, I'm sure. It is just too much to take in. It is just stupendous. And it's also a wonderful place to look at perspective and composition. You'll see even from these shots here, I've deliberately been using the vanishing points of perspective going away into the distance as we look down this one, for instance, with these hedges in these wonderful geometric shapes, as we look up some of the fish ponds in the way that they vanish away from us, the angles and forms of roofs and buildings and arches, but constantly these vanishing points. There's one we're seeing there of a single vanishing point looking through this arch, so we've got foreground, middle distance, looking here at again a figure in the foreground or the reflections in this pond. Two delightful examples of one-point perspective here of a single vanishing point as we look up these lines receding into the distance, where they would eventually meet on the horizon being our eye level, but of course you can't see the end of the horizon here.
Well, that completes our wonderful break in Spain. We've had 6 weeks now, and I've had a good idea of what Spain's about. We've been to the coast, we've been up into the country areas, the mountain areas, wonderful little leafy lanes full of poppies. It's the springtime, and we've seen the spring just coming through into summer. You'll see this right throughout the video. In the video I've tried to show you not only a bit of painting, mainly watercolours in this case, with some pastel and other mediums, but also to show you the countryside, the wildlife, some of the insects, the flowers, the sheer diversity and beauty of this country. So I do hope you've enjoyed these videos. I've had to split them into 2 because of the amount of film that I've done, and I hope there's enough painting on them for you. As I say, it wasn't just to produce a painting video, it was to get the feeling of the atmosphere of the place and show the sort of work that I do with that medium during a break like this, which has been so wonderful. I hope you've enjoyed it as well.